This is an excerpt from The Drum, A History by Matt Dean. Follow the links below to find out more or to purchase the book. The history of drum recording. This is a vast subject. The technologies, the people, the genres, and the political history that have sped up certain research, which in time benefited the recording studio, is worthy of an entire dedicated book. Therefore, this chapter simply attempts to outline and make sense of some key areas that have seen the recording environment develop to its present state. One where the drum, and specifically the notoriously difficult multi-voice drum kit, can be recorded to achieve the best results. As much as possible, the specifics of electrical recording equipment technology have been avoided, only mentioned when directly impacting the drum kit. Recorded sounds are irreversibly woven into the fabric of developed countrymen's lives today, to the point that we sometimes have to actively pursue silence if respite is desired. Blaring televisions, radios, PA system announcements, music, and a teenager in the next seat whose overly loud MP3 player is audible for every passenger on the bus, all contribute to the noise of our lives. But in the beginning it was a revolution. When music was first recorded, it was the first time the performer could hear himself in the same way that others hear him. It was the first time that the drummer could analyse every fill, every note on the hi-hat, and every snare backbeat for consistent dynamics. And with that insight, became incredibly self-critical. But also, for the first time, the sound was detached from the performance, and that sound was different. However it sounded in that concert hall or in the recording booth, it takes on its own life when amplified from a speaker in another room, another town, or another country. No matter how full and powerful the high-quality drum kit sounded to the naked ear in a live room, captured badly, it can sound like nothing more than old cardboard boxes. And so the relationship between the drummer and the studio technology had begun. And equally important, that between the drummer and the sound engineer or producer. The drummer had to find a way to get the sound that they wanted on a recording in the face of other people's opinions and technological limitations. It also meant that music could cross geographical boundaries with ease. Blues was not confined to the southern states' blacks, jazz to New Orleans, hip-hop to the Bronx. Anybody could now consume the music of any cultural group and feel a sense of belonging and understanding with that group. And this meant that drummers could draw on worldwide sounds, rhythms and techniques when developing their own sound. The notion of capturing sound is not a new one. The 16th century monk Rebellius wrote into one of his stories the concept of words frozen in time, only to thaw in the future and be heard again. The moral being that our actions will come back to haunt us. In the same century, the Italian scientist Giovanni Battista della Porta believed that he had captured words by speaking into lead piping and covering the ends, only for the words to be heard when the covers were later removed. But real progress was made 300 years later, when the dawn of sound recording was inspired and motivated by telecommunications. Men such as Oberlin Smith, Valdemar Poulsen, Alexander Bell, and of course, Thomas Edison, with his tin foil wrapped around a cylinder in 1877 to create the phonograph, were instrumental in these advances. Electrical recording and the use of magnetic tape was developed in the late 19th century, and it wasn't long before people started experimenting with recorded music on these formats. As time went on, the formats that were sold to consumers changed through wax and celluloid cylinders of the late 19th century, wax discs in the early 20th century, vinyl discs in the late 1930s, audio cassettes in the 1970s, and then digital recording with its zeros and ones, including the CD in 1983 and the DAT in 1986. As the technology changed, and equipment and recording methods with it, the result inevitably changed too. These eras are often so distinct that it is generally discernible, even to the untrained ear, as to which decade a musical recording was made from the drum sound alone. But this had less effect on the drummer. What really changed the drummer's job was that which was constantly evolving at the other end of the line, the recording studio. In the early 20th century, music recording really got going, but it was very rudimentary at first, and the drummer didn't comfortably fit into this new technology. Restrictions were felt in the early jazz records of music recording infancy, as songs were short by necessity of format length. In fact, until the 1940s, the 10-inch 78 RPM single side lasting 3 minutes was common, a time frame still adhered to today on radio singles despite technology advancing. But when subtracting time for the common jazz form with a head melody at the start and then again at the end, it left little time for the improvised solos that were fundamental to the style. This forced concise, brief solos that had maximum effect within their allotted time frame. It also meant minimising dynamic range, due to technological limitations in dealing with such volume increases as heard from the live musicians. This affected the drummer a great deal, because the recordings were achieved by the musicians playing into an acoustic recording horn, the small end of which was attached to a cutter needle that formed grooves on a cylinder or disc. The loud sound of a drum could knock the needle off course, meaning that many recordings omitted drumming, or the drummer had to play quietly on a muffled drum kit. The concise playing of soloists also affected the drummer, who lost the opportunity to develop and experiment within the solos, instead playing more solidly and simply. This effective and concise playing was to become one of the main attributes of the recording session drummer, and has pervaded commercial drum parts until this very day, spurred further since the introduction of radio in the 1920s. The 1920s also saw the introduction of the electrical microphone, which would make the recording horn obsolete. This technological advance allowed greater flexibility, opening up recording opportunities to quieter instruments, and would soon mean that the drummer could be heard much more clearly as well. One such early example came in the late 1920s, when recalling Louis Armstrong's desire to hear Zutty Singleton's drums more prominently in the mix than was usually expected, while recording the track Muggles. This was achieved by the producer holding the snare drum in his hand and Zutty playing it right beside the microphone. In the early 20th century, the major record labels began using purpose-built large studios such as EMI's Abbey Road, which opened in London in 1931. This recording studio complex was the largest of its kind, able to accommodate large orchestras with baffling to prevent leakage and multi-microphone recording capabilities, which became commonplace by the 1940s. The studios underwent different phases concerning the acoustic treatment of the rooms, but initially a very dead sound was required, to give the engineer more control over the final mix. In the smaller independent studios, however, it was more common to find a much smaller live room with 1, 2 or 3 allocated vocal microphones, and then a similarly small number to pick up the musicians. They placed themselves at appropriate positions from the microphone depending on the volume of their instrument, playing live as a group and capturing the full excitement of their performance. By the late 1940s, magnetic tape was introduced to the studios, and editing became much easier by cutting and sticking together again. This now meant that a mistake could be chopped out and different sections stuck together. The search for the perfect performance hurtled onwards. Into the 1950s, multi-track recording was being experimented with, and overdubbing became possible, a technique that was adopted by guitarist Les Paul, who created tracks by layering up instruments one at a time, a commonplace technique today. This was actually following a trend set by the Hollywood film studios that had already been doing this. The technique allowed musicians to record separately. They didn't even have to meet each other, as the drummer could record on Monday, the bass player on Tuesday, and so on. The musicians didn't even have to be in the same city or country, as the files could be transported to other studios. This was no longer a live ensemble performance. The distinction between live and studio had been pushed even farther apart. Of course, music was still often recorded with the musicians grouped together in one room, but things were changing. This was an excerpt taken from a book which covers the subject in far greater detail. The Drum, A History by Matt Dean, published by Scarecrow Press, is a comprehensive study into the history of the drum from the earliest evidence, looking deep into every culture across the world to chart the migration of the drums we know today and how religion, mythology, politics, communication, military use, survival, technology and fashions affected this evolution. This reference book seeks to answer many of the questions as to how the drum became the powerful and emotive instrument that we enjoy today. Follow the links below to find out more or to purchase the book.